Hey everybody, this is Blast from the Past.
But not, as always, with an ocean between, but this time live on set.
Live and direct from Atlanta, Georgia, in the deep, dirty South. We have combined forces, Michael and Ragnar, together at last to deliver you this live, fresh episode of Blast from the Past.
Man, it's really exciting. I mean, probably for you guys it's not gonna be that much different, but usually we record these podcasts in a Skype call and then we, edit everything together later. But this time I'm over in Atlanta and we thought we'd take the opportunity to first play a game from our past, and we did, and we had a lot of fun with that, and then also directly record the podcast right here. So maybe you feel a difference, maybe you feel the warmth between us a bit more than, I'm being silly.
Yeah, sure. So tell the beautiful people, what game did we play?
I think they already know because the title already suggests it, but we replayed Resident Evil. We thought we both hadn't finished the original Resident Evil in a minute.
Quite some time,
yeah.
Not since it came out. The Gamecube Remake originally came out back in 2002.
And here's the thing. I never played the Gamecube Remake completely. I just saw a friend play it. And the last time I finished Resident Evil was really when the original came out in 1996. I mean, it might have been 1997, but sometime back then, that was the last time I finished it. And it was one of those cool, spontaneous things. We actually had planned to talk about another game, but then it was lying around on Michael's PlayStation 4, and I said, hey, might just play Resident Evil.
I think we both had the Resident Evil series on the brain because we had just finished Resident Evil 7, both of us recently. Ragnar made an excellent video about that, link in the description.
Shameless plug.
Of course, naturally. That's what this is all about, baby! So we had both had Resident Evil on the brain because Resident Evil 7 was such an excellent return to form, taking these classic survival horror of like the first few Resident Evil games and kind of putting it in a different format, different context. So it was fresh on our brains, and we saw the Resident Evil remake lying around, and we thought, yes, this is the moment, this is the time.
And I think that's a good thing we could talk about, like just having finished Resident Evil 7, getting back to the original Resident Evil and seeing how close they actually are to each other. But before we go into all these depths, I mean, I don't think there is anybody out there who's never heard of Resident Evil, but maybe there are a few people who have never played the original or not even seen anybody play it. So let's start at the bottom and explain what the original Resident Evil, and not even the GameCube remake, but the original Resident Evil from 1996 is all about. You want to start?
Yeah. This is, Blast from the Past. I remember the first time I saw this game, I was in Florida for Christmas vacation with my family, and we were at the neighbor's house, and the kid had gotten a PlayStation for Christmas, and I remember that he had gotten Resident Evil with his PlayStation. I remember watching that game, and it was the scariest damn thing I had ever seen. Like, the game was so unnerving and eerie, and that's appropriate because this is the game that kicked off what we kind of know and love as the survival horror subgenre. So basically, in Resident Evil, it's a third-person, fixed camera, kind of almost isometric view, or different, not isometric, but like different angles, shots, movie-like shots, cinematic shots, as your character moves through this haunted house. And you encounter zombies and rabid dogs and all sorts of monsters and nasties, and you have to make your way through and solve puzzles and maybe get into a little combat. And the game was kind of centered around this idea of like, you're in a bad situation, your character is fragile, and you have limited resources. Like you can't really fight these things that effectively, so you've got to try to outsmart them, outmaneuver them, get around them. And this really, like Resident Evil, the game that came out in 1996, what we know of when we think of survival horror, all the way from Silent Hill on the PlayStation, all the way through to even, modern stuff like Outlast, Amnesia, all of this kind of like got its start with the survival horror genre. It really like taking clear inspiration from Night of the Living Dead, this idea of zombies in a haunted house,
also from Alone in the Dark. That's basically the archetype for the Resident Evil formula. Yeah, I interrupted.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's a great point, is that, Alone in the Dark is kind of probably the OG survival horror game because it set the template, it set this formula that Resident Evil has continued off of. Was Shinji Mikami was involved in Alone in the Dark? Am I remembering correctly?
No, that wasn't him. So. No. Okay. Alone in the Dark was a Western project. It was by Infogrames, which is a French developer, as far as I know, even. But I'm not sure if the developer was French or just the publisher. But what we're talking about basically is the format of, as Michael said, you have a character in third person, but not as we mostly know it, like a over-the-shoulder third-person shooter control mechanics, but
No regenerating health.
No regenerating health, right. And you have fixed camera angles that are often more cinematic effect than for perfect playability. The character is usually controlled with the so-called tank controls, which means when you stand, you press forward to move forward, you press backward to move backward, and you press left and right to really turn the character on the spot, which feels like controlling a tank a little bit. It's a bit clumsy, but all of this adds to the atmosphere. And what you just said, while we were playing it, because the camera angles are fixed and the cameras are never moving, and sometimes you see a shot from above, sometimes you see a shot from way below, which is kind of a Riefenstahl angle. So for me, because the cameras never move, the game is not even cinematic, but sometimes it feels photographic because a lot of emphasis is put on really a photographic beauty in the shot. Sometimes you have really stark shots that just let you see like 1 or 2 feet in front of the character. So it means like if a zombie is just next to you, you wouldn't even see it.
I mean, this is a good point because this is often done for effect. You know, like you have the combination of these kind of clunky, purposefully clunky controls that are a little bit difficult to wrestle with, combined with these very stark fixed camera angles that often makes you end up feeling like I'm having a difficult time maneuvering this character or getting around these enemies. And, you know, it's frustrating, but that is like very much done on purpose. You know, you are meant to feel like you're in a difficult situation where you really have to struggle to get through these puzzles, get around these monsters. You know, it very much adds to the experience. And so we noticed this, you know, playing the HD update of the remake that is now on PlayStation 4 is that you have the option to both do away with the tank controls and just control it with the analog stick, and to get rid of, you know, it kind of does like a pan and scan type thing. It doesn't have the fixed camera angles quite so much anymore.
There's a little bit movement that removes a little bit of the claustrophobia.
And that's exactly it. So if you do play this game, and if you're playing it on PC or on one of the modern consoles, definitely go with the original controls and the original camera angle, because one thing we found is that analog control totally trivializes the challenge of the game, and that is kind of what the tank controls drive home, is that if you can just press down on the analog stick and immediately skirt your character away, then there's no challenge in getting around the zombies. Whereas with the tank controls, you know, you have to press a button combination to do a 180 and then press forward on the button to run away.
It takes way longer.
Yeah. So both the, you know, the analog controls totally trivialize the challenge, and then I found that the moving camera angles detracted from the horror, because so much of it is centered around this idea of claustrophobia, where you're uncertain what's just outside the edge of the frame, that any movement kind of really dispelled that tension for me.
That the character should totally see. Like,
exactly.
There's a zombie like just 3 meters in front of you, but you can see it because the camera just focuses on beauty instead of playability. But what is the story about? Let's start with the story, because the original Resident Evil started with an amazingly campy live-action cinematic.
Yes.
No! Don't go!
So it starts out, you hear about some kind of weird murders that have taken place in the area of Raccoon City, in the forest area of Raccoon City, and you are one of a group of special operatives called the Stars, who are sent out with a helicopter to investigate another team of your group that has disappeared. And your helicopter, does your helicopter get shot?
I think it just there's a you're
there
able
is a
to
down helicopter.
You go to find the other team's down helicopter, but then your guy turns coward and runs away when he hears you fighting the monsters, and
exactly.
So you're stranded in this murky woods, being attacked by these vicious-looking dead dogs that have risen from the grave somehow.
And that's still just still cinematic. So some rabid dogs attack you, and it's all very hectic. Lots of cuts and bad acting, and the people are running away towards an eerie old mansion where they seek refuge, shelter.
Jill, run for that house!
And they find themselves in the foyer, and then all of a sudden, it's this big, kind of elegant, but also like strangely quiet and empty. Clearly there's something a little bit ominous, a little bit foreboding about this place. There's this kind of faded elegance to it, like it looks like very well furnished, fine marble floors, lots of detailed, intricate artwork, fancy wallpapers,
paintings,
expensive urns, and silverware out everywhere. Like this is clearly some sort of wealthy, opulent mansion, but it's so spooky because there's nobody around that you can find except for the thunder and lightning strikes off in the distance to keep you company.
The thunder and lightning strikes that always appear in the most cinematically intense moments.
Yes.
Right. Also, you can select one of two characters. You can either play as Chris or you can play as Jill. And both of them deliver kind of a somewhat different experience. So there are slight story differences because you interact with different characters. And also you have a different inventory. For example, with Chris, you have a few inventory slots more. But as Jill, you have a few less, but therefore you are the master of all locks. So Jill basically has a lockpick and she can open certain doors for which Chris needs to find single-use keys to open them, right? So this is it. And then, of course, one of the most convenient horror tropes kicks in, which is we should split up.
Right.
Because there's clearly something dangerous and eerie going on that we don't understand. So the best idea is we're
split up to investigate.
Let's split up, and that's what happens. And then you're on your own, and you're exploring this mansion, which is, it's not that big, right? Because after a couple of hours, you start knowing all the nooks and crannies, all the rooms, but it's a bit tedious to explore it all because there might be a zombie around every corner. It is not that intense in terms of combat. Like the first game really has more of a focus on oftentimes on avoiding combat on purpose. And that's very interesting. We're going to talk about this, but you can see that because the GameCube Remake actually added a few interesting mechanics and enemies that further emphasize this. Sometimes it's better to avoid combat rather than, go in guns blazing.
Yeah, at a certain point you realize that it's, especially on the harder difficulties, it's much more advantageous not to fight the zombies, not to waste your resources, but to just try to outmaneuver them, get around them, just to treat them as an obstacle. Really, rather than like something you got to fight through. So, that the other half of this exploration is there's combat against these monsters and these baddies roaming the mansion, and they're ripped straight out of classic horror movie tropes. You have zombies, you have the rabid dogs, you have these big lizard men looking things, you have killer plants, like something out of Little Shop of Horrors.
Giant spiders,
giant snake, all sorts of, crazy.
Why does it always have to be snakes?
Always snakes. So all sorts of like classic baddies, and you have to either fight or maneuver your way through a lot of them, but you have very limited resources. Ammo is scarce, your guns aren't super powerful, it takes a lot of shots to put enemies down. And so you're constantly having to perform this juggling act of, should I go this way or should I try to... There's a lot of enemies in this hallway. Maybe I should try to see if I can find a way around.
Yes.
Or I guess I can charge through, but, then I'm going to be totally out of ammo by the time I get through to the other side. And what if there's something else bad in there? Or, I just took a beating. I've got to backtrack because my health is so low. I need to return and get one of my very limited supply of healing items to move forward. And then, so leading into perhaps like this most genius aspect of the game that we both really appreciated replaying it is the fact that your saves are limited. You have a limited resource called ink ribbons that you can use to save your game.
On typewriters, which makes sense. And typewriter is the item that lets you save, but they are... They are limited, so you really have to think, okay, will I venture forth a little bit more, risking to die and having to replay the whole section that I just finished, or will I save and waste another ink ribbon? And actually, while we were playing through it, we had phases where it felt like we had plenty of ink ribbons, and we could come on, we can save,
just
we have
burn
enough.
one or two,
and then suddenly we found ourselves in a part where we had to stand through a big part of the game without once having
a nail biter, you know, an
And I
hour and
remember
30, an hour 45 minutes without a save, and we were both starting to like sit up towards the edge of our seat, like if we die now, this is it. Like this could ruin our, you know, this could make us have to step away from the game for the rest of the evening. Like it could have been so devastating if we had lost all that progress.
Exactly.
But that's what's so great about it, is that it inspires that tension.
It keeps you on your toes. Yeah, I remember you were playing that part, and I could really see you get tenser. And so, because when you kill an enemy, there are certain different mechanics in place. And let's talk about the GameCube remake, or in this case, the HD remake of the GameCube remake, because they added a lot of cool things that further emphasize this notion that something can happen all the time. For example, the classic standard enemy is a zombie. And yeah, you need like 4 shots, then it drops down, it gets back up, and maybe you need 2-3 shots more, and then it seems to be dead. And it keeps being on the floor for quite some time. And then you roam around the house, and after, I don't know, 10-15 minutes or maybe longer, you return to that room without suspecting anything, and suddenly that guy's back up. He has a red head, he's suddenly really fast and angry. He's not the typical Romero zombie, but he's more along the lines of the
28 Days Later.
28 Days Later zombie.
Or God forbid.
And he
Zack
turned
Snyder.
into a Crimson Head because you just put him down but didn't dispatch him. And this is sometimes really intense because the game gives you means to dispatch of zombies without them turning into Crimson Heads. One of the ways would be if you have a very powerful gun, like the shotgun or a revolver, and you aim the gun slightly upwards and wait till they're really close, then you really just burst their heads apart. So this is one way to dispatch of a zombie so it doesn't come back, or you actually get an item for it. You get a lighter and a canteen with kerosene, right? But you have to refill that, and it's also a limited resource. So every time you dispatch a zombie and you didn't burst his head apart, you have to set him on fire.
Douse them in kerosene and then light them up. And so you definitely do not have enough kerosene to douse every single zombie in the game. So you have to be, if you do kill them, you have to be tactical about which ones you kill, and you think maybe, okay, I want to clear out this hallway because this is right outside a save zone, so I can create my little safe area here, like in this area outside of a save room, by killing the zombies and then burning their bodies. But so all of this stuff together that we're talking about, the limited ammo, limited health resources, saves being a consumable item via these ink ribbons, having to burn and dispose of these corpses, all of this combines together to create this sense of attrition where every action you perform, whether that's shooting your gun, burning a zombie, whatever, it has to be planned, and it is consuming some sort of irreplaceable resource, So you have to be very considered with what you do because you're using something that you just can't get back. And all of it combines to create exactly this survival horror atmosphere where you really start to feel like I'm in a dangerous situation and I have to be very careful with what I do, and I'm really like second guessing my every move and having to play very canny and conserve my resources. And there isn't really anything quite like it, and there hasn't been anything quite like it since it came out. It really is its own beast.
One thing that I really gotta say is, while we're talking about this, is we played it together, but I mean, it's a single player game. But what we did, kind of, the basic idea for it was, let's bring back the good old times of hot seat playing. I mean, some of you might remember that because it's kind of a forgotten thing from the past. Hot seat basically means 2 players play a single player game, and as soon as you die, you would swap the controller. And that's what we basically did, but overall, we finished the entire game. We didn't use a walkthrough. We went through all the puzzles in combined cranial effort. And that was so interesting because after a while, you could feel that there's a certain pattern to how we'd approach the game. We would get back to a save room. We don't always have to save there, but those are the spaces. They have like a super soothing music that tells you, all right, it's fine. There's even a lamp. When you look at it, it says something, the warm light feels comfortable and warm. You feel safe here. So you're safe there. They have item boxes. And as we said, the inventory management is tedious. Sometimes you find a crucial item, but you just don't have any space left in your inventory. So the item boxes, they are scattered all around the mansion. And everything you put in the item box, it will be accessible from everywhere in the mansion. So that's kind of a convenient feature, but you constantly have to do this. And of course, there's a typewriter in this save room with which you might save or might not. But usually it goes back to go to the save room, do inventory management, look at the map, and then we would plan our next moves. Like, where will we go now? What do we need for that? How many health items do we need? Do we have anything left somewhere else on the way? Which way is the fastest? Which way is the most convenient? Maybe there are enemies in between, so we might pick another route. And that's what we would plan ahead and then do our move. Then it all goes full circle in the end, because after a while you come back to the item room because you need to do new inventory management. And so in a way, the game kind of circles a little bit. You know, it's this. It has a certain rhythm to it. It's split in different phases, like the planning, almost like an old Rainbow Six game. You know, first you do your plan, then you execute the plan, then you might have to improvise if something goes wrong, and things will go wrong, because one of the other things that keeps you on your toes is you can clear out all the rooms, but if you advance at a certain point in the story, you might trigger something that will unleash new enemies in rooms that you already know. So you can't just return leisurely thinking, oh, we're fine here, because if you do that, you'll be surprised. At some point, maybe a few zombies just burst through the window. And you could have seen that before, because usually the game signposts that. For example, there's this amazing corridor, which is like, it's super dark, it's only lit with sunlight from the outside window, and after a while when you go through it, you can see the shadow on the other wall. There are like hands from zombies that are trying to break through the window, and you think like, oh, I hope they won't come in here. But of course, at a later point in the game, when you almost forgot about them, suddenly they burst in. And these guys.
This game is very good at this. So, you know, as you progress, you know, back and forth through the mansion, you know, the environment will begin to change in little subtle ways. Like there's one hallway very famously where like you pass through it the first time and you hear this loud cracking sound. And you see, if you look closely, you could see that like, oh, the windows just, you know, buckled a little bit and they're cracked now. Like something hit the windows and you heard this cracking noise. Oh my gosh. Well, I wonder what was that? What was running up against the windows? So you leave and you go through, and yes, maybe you proceed through some puzzles and you don't think about it. And then you come back through this hallway a second time. And this is where this very famous moment happens, where I think if you ask anybody, like, what is this moment where this game really scared the crap out of you, and, you know, you first have your fond moment of Resident Evil really like cementing its place in your heart. And it is this moment where you're coming back through and these dogs jump through the window.
Yeah, this famous L-shaped hallway. You pass it once and you just hear some scratches on the window. They just startle you a bit. And the second time you pass through it, the dogs just burst straight through the window, rush at you, jump at you, and everybody loves that scene.
And so you end up feeling, you know, it undermines your trust in like the stability of the world, basically. You really start to think to yourself like, wow, I'm safe now, but anything could happen here. Like, I better watch my back. I've always got to be on guard when I'm entering a new room, even if it's one I've already cleared, because who knows what could be cropping back up. Like, you never feel totally safe, totally secure. Like, you are always in a little bit of danger, or it's always in the back of your head as you move through the mansion.
Okay, yeah. And one thing that's also a key component of the game is, we mentioned these a couple of times, it's a mansion that, and you will find out later that there is a purpose to all of that, but it's a mansion that was built by some genius architect. It was supposed to hide certain secrets of a research organization that were experimenting with viral research that turned into these mean zombies, these dogs, these lizard men, and all these kind of abominations that you encounter.
And so this is, and I love, it's such a cheesy plot, because as we talked about, especially the original version, you know, on PlayStation, it, you know, it kind of had, the GameCube remake had these okay CGI, still a little bit doll looking, a little bit uncanny valley, but it was okay, it was serviceable. Now the original has these like very cheesy live action sequences that are just legendarily bad, and, you know, the voice acting is so hammy, so terrible, but it's, you know, it's really all kind of done in service to like these classic monster movie tropes. But then what lurks underneath it, and what I find so interesting about the game, is that it's very much in tune with this 90s sensibility of having this conspiratorial fear of these gigantic multinational corporations that are in bed with the government. You can't trust anybody. There's drugs in the tap water that's turning people into zombies, you know, this type of stuff. And so this game is like so classically in the style of, you know, John Carpenter's They Live situation, where you have this evil corporation that you find out is running experiments in this small Midwestern town, you know, Nowheresville, America. There's this dark research laboratory lurking just underneath the surface where they're literally turning people into zombies. I mean, it's blunt, you know, there's nothing subtle about it, but it's wonderful. It's so great. It's so entertaining.
And it's also, I mean, how much can we spoil? I think
it's a pretty old game.
It's a pretty old game. I think we can spoil a lot, and a lot of people probably that haven't played the first already have played other games of the so we're gonna spoil a little bit. So for example, the main villain, Wesker, he's initially one of your team, but he right off the bat looks totally villainized. Like he's wearing sunglasses at night.
He's got the black lace-up combat boots, the black Kevlar, black sunglasses,
slick back hair, and always kind of a little bit of an arrogant vibe to him. It's like, oh, we should check out this hallway.
He always seems like he really knows what's going on, and he's not letting the rest of y'all into the joke. Like, he's kind of always got that attitude that he's got one up on everybody else.
And that's what it is, basically, right? Because your crew is eventually led into a trap, so everybody shall be disposed of because they know too much about the research and all that kind of stuff.
But not just that, but it's so cynical even. In the files you find, they say, like, they'll call in the stars, and your main objective is to collect combat data on how our bioweapons. So, you know, the spoiler alert, but the plot ultimately is that they're developing these monsters, these these lizard men, these ravenous insects. They're developing them as biological weapons to be used in war. And so the whole plot, the whole reason that your team is even there is
tested.
It's your combat tests. They're testing their new weapons against you. It's a classic tale of corporate malfeasance.
And the game also changes flavor or the general feeling quite a couple of times because, as we said, as it starts out, you really know nothing of what's going on. You start investigating, and then you reach certain parts that are outside of the main mansion, like a basement laboratory or some kind of catacombs. And you also constantly hear like the cries of some girl, maybe, which then in the end turns out this is the GameCube remake because they added this character later, and I said that usually if you remake a game and try to stay within the flavor of the classic, so if you don't change the whole formula, but then you add characters, you can often end up having fans that feel like you've done them a disservice by altering the story. But in this case, what they added is the whole backstory to this mansion, like who built this mansion, and his name was it George?
Trevor.
George Trevor, right.
Spencers were like the owners of the mansion,
exactly.
the rich benefactors of Umbrella, but the Trevor family were the ones who designed.
And the Trevor family, they are kind of the really unfortunate part of this whole story, and it's a wonderfully tragic tale. Basically, George Trevor is the architect, and his family, his wife and his child, had been sent to Spencer Mansion, but Spencer, who is like the evil dude who set it all up, they capture all of them and they dispose of George Spencer, so because he knows too much, and they just use his wife and his daughter as test subjects. And you find out pretty quickly that the mother, Jessica, she didn't live quite long because she couldn't stand the viral experiments on her body, but her daughter her daughter Lisa, she was actually immune to these viral tests, and they tested on her for 30 years until she turned into an invincible abomination. And you only find that out through little like notebook entries,
sad little diaries. And then it gets grisly because you find out, oh my God, she missed her mother and father so much that she flayed their skin off and is wearing it like a second set of clothes.
So this is kind of the strongest story and also one of the strongest enemies in the game. You encounter Lisa later on a couple of times. She really is absolutely invincible. And the whole thing ends with you opening up the sarcophagus where her mother lies in, because Lisa was actually just looking for a mother the entire time, and then the sarcophagus opens and she takes out the skull of the mother and jumps into the abyss. And that's such a wonderful addition to the story. And I always thought, like, this is the most Silent Hill-ish story in the entire Resident Evil universe, because it's such a personal story. Usually the Resident Evil lore is about, I mean, of course there are personal tragedies and everything, but usually it's about conspiracy.
Yeah, that's
a
a really good thing you pointed out, because I think you definitely noticed that in like the lore that is included in this game, all the different files and whatnot, is that this game, like the first Resident Evil and then the remake for the GameCube, very consciously wants to tell like this kind of small, focused story of, this ill-fated team of police commandos and then the poor people who used to live and work at this mansion, and kind of telling these personal tragedies as they're like, oh, we got turned into science experiments, or oh, I'm being kept a prisoner here, how will I possibly get out? All of them come to miserable, unfortunate, unhappy ends. And in that way, it does kind of share a lot. The first Resident Evil game does share a little bit in common with Silent Hill. There are definitely some points of comparison. They went in very different directions, obviously, as the years went on, but I think you can kind of see where they both sprouted from the same seed, if you will.
Itchy, tasty.
Yes.
So you find so many. That's so cool about it, because as I said, there are not so many enemies. It doesn't feel like the game just throws legions of enemies at you. It's never a hack and slash, and you mostly avoid combat. And oftentimes you find something like a journal entry of some person who has worked in the mansion, some scientist, and you can even, like, there's this legendary journal where you can read over time how the language becomes less and less intricate, and the sentences get shorter, worse grammar, and the last entry just reads itchy, tasty.
Very like body horror almost. Like we're getting this window into this poor person's decline as they get taken over by this terrible virus.
And after you read that, you find exactly this guy around the corner. Or I'm not exactly sure, but I know that this was the case for one of the scientists in the laboratory later.
We find the journal of the guy who said, I don't want to turn into one of those things, I'm going to end my own life. And we find him hanging in the room, and then we discover this journal, and that's, oh my god, you realize this guy killed himself because he didn't want to turn into a zombie.
There's a lot of personal story about it, which makes it so nice to discover, because it makes it worth reading through all the stuff, because there's always some kind of small epiphany that you can get from really reading closely what's written there. It's not just at random. But yeah, and what I said before, that will be a good segue to talk about the similarities with 7. Because as I said, there are different flavors. As I said, you start out with this really eerie, underpowered situation in the main mansion. It's a lot about puzzles, and then as the game progresses, the kind of scare changes a little bit. You have a situation that's more tailored towards entomo and arachnophobia. That's like a second part of the building. Then you have like these really confined catacombs, which are more like a puzzle, because the enemy, you can't fight this enemy, you have to outmaneuver it and be smart about it. And then in the end it turns into, I wouldn't say it doesn't turn into an action game, but at the end you get to a point where you're far more stocked up than in the rest of the game. You have far more resources. Oh god, I got so many health items back in my item box, and that's because you saved up a lot of it. You were careful with the inventory space that you had and with all the items, because the game taught you that. And then in the end you kind of feel like you rise as the phoenix from the ashes,
and it's not just this general pacing of the game. Like, I think replaying the remake, I was blown away, because I had also just recently played through the new Resident Evil 7, which if you're listening to this and this is all the sort of thing you're interested in, you should probably buy and play Resident Evil 7. It is an excellent game. It is very much worth playing if you're into this kind of stuff.
And that's the beautiful thing, that by replaying the HD remake, or basically by replaying the original Resident Evil, it was just so obvious how close the new Resident Evil
Yes.
7, even
Yes.
though it was a completely different camera perspective, even though they turned it into a first-person shooter, even though they told a story that at first seemed not to be connected at all
Right.
with this one, how similar it felt, how similar it was paced. It started out with the same what is happening here,
Right.
with a sense of mystery.
You start out in an initial mansion, then you make your way through to some sort of secondary residence where the conspiracy deepens, and then you
and that's tailored around Entomo and
yes,
arachnophobia.
around, yeah, insects and
Insects, yeah.
snakes and yeah, and then you come back and you solve more puzzles, and then you're getting more gear, and you transition into this end game where all of a sudden you're mowing enemies down, whereas first you were trying to carefully sneak around them or avoid combat. And obviously there's the stylistic stuff, like, you know, you have the save rooms with the calming music. Resident Evil 7 very self-consciously has that. You have, you know, wacky puzzles that would never exist in real life, but, you know, are perfectly suited for the purposes of a video game. And, you know, they even make a joke about it directly. And I think this was the moment.
Yes.
It's pretty early on in the game. It's like within the first hour or two, you know, you get this moment where you solve a puzzle.
This
It's
shadow puzzle
yes,
thing.
you
yeah.
have to manipulate an object and make a shadow line up on the wall, and then that unlocks a secret passageway. And after you're in Resident Evil 7, after your character performs this, you know, they quip this line to themselves: who builds this shit? And that's so perfect because that's always what you, the character, are thinking when you have these ridiculous puzzles where it's like, oh, if I rearrange the books on the bookshelf, it will open a secret passageway, or I need to manipulate the arms on the grandfather clock and that will move aside to reveal some sort of hidden key. Like, that is what you think as a player. And so to me, seeing this little joke in Resident Evil 7, I read that a lot of people didn't like it, like, oh, it took me out of my immersion or whatever. But for me, this was so perfect because it was such an acknowledgement of what makes the original Resident Evil great, and then being like, hey, it's cool, we love it too, and we're not taking this too seriously. Just come along for a fun ride.
My favorite WTF moment was always in Resident Evil 1, you have to find the sheet music to Beethoven's Moonshine Sonata and either let Jill play it on the piano, or if you're Chris, you find another character who is able to play the piano. And then that character has to play the Moonlight Sonata, which unlocks a secret passage. And that was always... not even who builds this shit, but how.
Right,
how
yeah.
would you build that? How would you build a piano that is, you know...
What is that? That is from, like, I want to say a James Bond movie originally. Like, that's definitely a reference to some sort of, like, classic spy movie where someone opened a secret passage.
Oh, that's
by playing
Batman.
Oh, was that Batman? That was
Batman always had like the laboratory
Yes,
in the
okay.
basement, but in that case there was like Alfred pressing like a cacophony on the upper scales of the piano. It was like click, click, click. And then the bookshelf would move to the side and go.
Was that
went
the Christopher Nolan Batman?
No, that I don't think that was in the Nolan Batman.
Okay.
I remember I was in an amusement park on a Batman ride, and they had like this.
Okay.
So, but I think it was I don't remember, but I'm pretty sure that it's a Batman thing. Maybe it's been in several.
Sure. Anyway, all of which is, we're on a bit of a tangent here. All of which is to say is, yeah, ridiculous puzzles are absolutely the norm in 7, just
And it's wonderful.
as they are in 1. Yeah, and so replaying these games, we really did come to this realization that Resident Evil 7 is almost, I don't want to say like a beat for beat remake, but they stuck so closely to the original formula that
Formula, that's it, right?
all that really changed was the perspective, you know, because the pacing of the combat is kind of similar. You start out trying to avoid it, and then you become more powerful towards the end. The resource management is the same. You have
Yes.
similar puzzles. You have these
Even
similar...
though in 7 they are a bit more generous, because later on you get some backpacks that give you a
Right.
bit more breathing room.
Right.
And in the original Resident Evil, you still have these, like with Jill, you have 6
I think you have 8 with Jill
8
and 6 with Chris.
and 6
Yeah.
or in hard difficulty, it's even less.
Right.
You just try the hard difficulty, and there you have only 6 with Chris, which is... I find this is a bit harsh.
And that's
you
the
know?
point, though. You really got to struggle
Yes,
for
yes,
it.
Yes. So one thing I always noticed was that when we were playing the first game and we tried to figure out some puzzle, and I was starting to really elaborate on what could it be, what should we do, and we just had this one item and another place where it could... For example, there's a broken flamethrower that you find later, and then there's a place where you might put it in, but it doesn't really make sense. Why would you open a door with a broken flamethrower? There is no real logic to that. Why would that be the key to a door? But then Michael oftentimes said like, yeah, that you don't need to think too much, but because these puzzles, they're mostly straightforward, and that's basically it. They're not made to, like in a classic LucasArts point-and-click adventure, they're not made to have you stuck for days.
Right.
It's just a
I've
little
got to
bit
combine the banana with the matchbook in order to clear the boulder out of the... I mean, I'm coming up with a fake-sounding LucasArts puzzle, but it sounds like it could have been real there for a second.
You gotta use a monkey with a screw to open it up because
that's right.
Because it's a monkey wrench.
Right.
That was an actual puzzle in Monkey Island too. With a pump, with a valve, something like that.
There we go.
So it's not like this. It's not meant to stall you for ages. It's more meant to give you a little bit of friction and also a little bit of difference in kind. So it's not a constant shooter or it's a constant puzzle game, but it's
a little bit of both.
It's a mixture. You do different things. You do inventory management. You do planning. You do combat, and it's all kind of very evened out. So
the
you never
game
get
definitely
bored.
wants you to succeed. Getting back to the remake here originally, I mean, Resident Evil 7 too. Pretty much everything we say about remake kind of goes too for Resident Evil 7. That's the interesting thing about this conversation that we realized is that all of these wonderful things we're saying, like with the exception of the perspective, because Resident Evil 7 is in the first person, all of these things we're talking about, it holds exactly true.
And a
for
slightly
7
different
as well.
setting, you know?
True.
Yeah.
But all of which is to say is that, like, getting back to the remake, the game really wants you to succeed. It is not, it starts off a little bit confusing as you get your bearings. You might die once or twice and lose some progress and get frustrated. But ultimately, the puzzles are not overly complex and difficult. The game definitely gives you enough resources that you will get by if you're smart. Ultimately, the game is more interested in, I think, kind of presenting an experience to you than it is necessarily in being a difficult combat game or presenting like brain-taxing puzzles. It's not really anything like that. Everything is just kind of set up so that you kind of move through and have kind of almost this aesthetic experience. It's meant to invoke an emotion, a sensation in you.
We noticed this a couple of times. It is not a hard game by any means. It is not hard, but sometimes it really feels hard. It's not like...
It's those exact moments when you've gone an hour and 30 minutes without saving, and it's like, well, nothing we did was particularly difficult, but it's like, we solved a bunch of puzzles, we defeated a bunch of monsters. It's like, it would really, imagine having to go through that and do that all over again. Like, it creates this tension where you realize that, like, if I mess up once or twice, that'll be it. And you really get on guard and you get on edge, and that's a feeling. When I felt that feeling, I was like, this is it. This is
almost
the feeling.
Like a roguelike at some point, right?
It's like, this is the reason people play these games, is this exhilaration of kind of like tap dancing on the edge of disaster and not knowing, where you're going to land on it.
I'm not sure, this phase we talked about that almost took 2 hours without us having the means to say it. And also we had the first encounter with Lisa Trevor, the unbeatable foe. Do you think we would have finished the game if you would have died there? Because it feels like that would have been a tough call.
I think we would have. I think we might have needed... I think that might have been we need to step away from this game and play something else and then maybe pick this up again tomorrow. Like, I think we were on a pretty good tear. Like, I think we could have done it, but it would have been... Man, I would have been devastated. I would have had a moment had we lost all that progress.
I mean, retracing the steps usually doesn't even take a quarter of the time.
Sure.
The effect when you're working on something, for example, I once had this experience where I was on a long flight or many connect flights, and I had my laptop with me, and I was working on something really important for university with Photoshop. And I was working for over a day, so the whole trip took me 3 days. And I was working for over 2 days, and then Photoshop crashed, and I realized I didn't save a single time. It was still in unknown title. And I literally cried at the airport there. I felt so lost. The thing is, I shed a few tears, and it was like, all right, come on, you got to finish this anyway. Get back at it. I was back to that stage in an hour, maybe an hour and a half, and it looked better than before. Because the whole figuring out, and that's where we go back to Resident Evil, in this case, when we would have died, we would have known exactly what to do. It would just be like, okay, go there, get this item, you know that these enemies are there, so this time they won't do you any damage because you can avoid them, and then you retrace the steps probably in half an hour max. But it's still this tedious roguelike feeling that I've just made a lot of progress,
Right.
and now it's all gone.
Yeah, and it did happen to us. Twice? I think we died twice or something. We were
We
maybe
died
2-3
twice
times.
or
Like
thrice, yeah.
we were just kind of being a little bit careless, and then you end up losing 20-30 minutes of progress, and it's not a huge deal, but those are the moments where the game really drives home the like, man, you need to be paying attention. Like this, something could catch you off guard. Be on guard because you're in a dangerous situation and anything could happen.
What I also liked was the observation that something you noticed not too long ago, how Resident Evil seems to come in trilogies. You have the first trilogy that started with the original that Shinji Mikami created. Also interesting to notice that initially the game was meant to be a first-person shooter.
Yes.
That's what he had in mind, but the team quickly found out that the PS1 or the PSX, the hardware limitations were just too stark.
Because I think, by the time when Resident Evil was in development, Quake hadn't even been released yet. Quake wasn't released until 1996, I don't think. So, what would the most advanced first-person shooter at the time was something like Doom 2? So this technology...
And that was fake 3D.
Exactly. This is, so this technology to create this first-person experience, that the original Resident Evil in 96 was supposed to be, the technology just wasn't there. So how wonderful that it all got to kind of come full circle. And then with 7... they made the kind of Resident Evil that might have originally had been made had they had the technology back in the day.
Especially in terms of the experience, because 7, what you can just say, you can like it or not, but it's hard to say Resident Evil 7 is a bad game. And that's what I like about the idea. Resident Evil 1 was a fantastic game. Resident Evil 2 was also an awesome game that kind of iterated on the idea, that put an interesting new twist on it. It was a bit more action. It was a bit more,
Yes.
And then, 3 was still good, I guess.
Yeah, 3, it was a good game, but it got much more towards the, just straightforward boom, 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 boom. It was much more action-oriented, much lighter on the puzzles, I think. It had this interesting concept. I think the reason a lot of people remember 3 very fondly is because of Nemesis, which is, it's this monster that kind to pursues you, and it will appear at random locations throughout the game, and you're never quite sure what causes...
Still scary and a very good game. And then you had a couple of spin-offs like Zero, which we just played a couple of hours. Also the remake, which I think it's a great game so far. It has a different twist on it, you have 2 players that you can switch between, and some of the puzzles are tailored around that, which is interesting. I made the observation that it's kind of like a mixture between Resident Evil and Day of the Tentacle.
A little bit. So these are these classic third-person Resident Evil games, and then you have, the second trilogy that followed was Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6, starting with 4 in 2005, I think it was, early 2005 the game was released.
I couldn't be certain now.
I want to say, and again, I remember...
I don't want to lie.
Sure, I believe it was early 2005, but I remember playing that game when it came out and just being utterly blown away. There had never been anything like that. And again, this was another game, very well, Resident Evil 4, that kind of took the classic Resident Evil formula of tank controls and these puzzles and resource management and being in a scary situation and having to deal with kind of these... There was a lot more combat because there were so many more monsters and zombies.
You didn't have tank controls anymore.
I think you still had to.
In 4?
You couldn't strafe. In the original version of 4, you couldn't strafe.
Are you sure?
I'm 99% positive.
Okay, cool.
I'm 99% positive.
I'm not an expert on 4, so
in the updated, they did release updated versions of 4 that had almost more standard third-person shooter controls. But in the original Resident Evil 4, you could not strafe.
I played it later then.
You had to do the tank thing. But anyway, so it had these kind of clunky controls. But it ushered in this era, Resident Evil 4 ushered in this era of this third-person action formula for Resident Evil, which is much more combat-oriented, much more about, having a lot of ammo, mowing down a lot of enemies, and much lighter on the puzzles. And so a lot of longtime fans of this series with number 5, and then especially with number 6, people started to complain that, well, these aren't really anything like the original Resident Evil games anymore. They're very action-oriented, and they're very almost like Hollywood spectacle, over-the-top, like a Michael Bay style ridiculousness. So, I think...
My personal lowest point was 5.
Yes.
And I want to clarify that I don't think that it is a bad game. It's just not what I was looking for in a Resident Evil 5. So I played this game and I realized that 10 minutes into the game, I had already mowed down armies of zombies. And I know that a lot of people, especially in co-op, enjoyed this game a lot.
I was about to say that was my experience. I was in college at the time, and a couple beers, some rounds of co-op on Resident Evil 5. Like, it was a fine experience.
Sounds like a good time.
Yeah, we had a good time, but when I think back on it, like, the game was not great. It was competent, but not great. It was very silly. And for me, what I think about, the moment that sticks out to me is that moment of punching that goddamn boulder at the end of the game. That was the moment where I was like, man, maybe Resident Evil isn't for me anymore. Like, maybe this series has passed me by. Well, you're fighting Wesker in this volcano crater, and he's turning into some dinosaur-looking creature, and then, it ends with Chris Redfield punching a boulder off a cliff. It's so over the top that I was like, maybe this series isn't for me anymore. And how wonderful that we get to see it come back to its roots with 7, because now with maybe potentially the start of like this new first-person movement in Resident Evil, getting back to the roots.
Now let's just hope. I mean, that's cool. We had a great Resident Evil 7 that feels eerily close to the first. And now I personally am really excited to see where they take it. There's still the Chris DLC that's not out yet while we're recording the podcast. It's probably going to be out when it...
As of our recording, not yet.
Right.
Not yet.
And I'm still excited to see where they go with that, and also where they take the whole thing.
Yes.
If 2 is...
But let's spoil it, because I think we're all eagerly anticipating. So there's this post-story DLC that's going to be coming out free for everybody, called Not a Hero, I think. And so, this is a spoiler warning for Resident Evil 7. Skip ahead in the next 2 minutes or whatever if you don't want to hear it. Anyway, so at the end of Resident Evil 7, your character is rescued by Chris Redfield, or someone who looks It's someone who says he is Chris Redfield.
Yeah.
Okay, by Chris Redfield, who is the hero of the first game. This game we're talking about, the very first Resident Evil. This is the moment where it's like, we can see how 7 is part of the larger mythology now. But the interesting thing about this ending is that on the side of the helicopter that carries you away is a logo that says Umbrella Corps. Umbrella, the big bad guys who were trying to kill Chris in 1.
I'm pretty sure that it says Umbrella Corporations, although I'm not 100%
I thought it was Core. Like,
no, I'm pretty sure it's the blue one with Corporation. Yeah. But he's part, apparently, of Umbrella now.
So now we're left with this, and this is for, like, the real lore nerds and the series geeks now. What a teaser. Like, this beloved hero from the first game is working with the bad guys? Why? How possibly? Like... what a great cliffhanger, and I think we're all eagerly...
Maybe the bad guys aren't the bad guys after all.
Oh my God. But you know what? I don't know how I'd feel about that. What if they do some kind of, some ridiculous retcon twist? Umbrella was never the bad guys the whole time. Actually, they were trying to save us from the real bad guys. Like, I could see them trying to do something like that. I don't know if I'd like that. I think that might be kind of dumb.
I mean, we're speculating.
Sure.
There's one speculation that I have is, in the later parts of Resident Evil 7, you get more powerful weaponry on the ship part. For those who have played it, it's like the part where you have more armament and you're like better equipped and better at combat in general. So it doesn't feel like the survival horror anymore. Anyway, so the weaponry on that ship, where you find out that the whole viral research thing for the 7th game started, it all features Russian weaponry, and I'm still wondering if we might venture into Russia in some way in the next games.
Perhaps. Because there was a sequence in Eastern Europe in the 6th game, I think. There was some sort of war zone. I watched a Let's Play of it, didn't play it myself, but yeah, there was some sort of Russian-inspired setting in the 6th game, so it could be potentially.
There might be something, but...
We shot a Russian gun ourselves. Yeah, so shout out to the audience. While Ragnar was here, I had to give him a little bit of that southern flavor, so we went to a shooting range nearby. Yeah, shout out to a Quick Shot shooting range in
Atlanta.
In North Decatur. They had an AK-47 ready to rent. We rented it, fired off some Russian ammo. And this is one of the many wonderful things about being in America. It took all of 10-15 minutes to sign the papers and turn over RDs. Right. Unthinkable in Europe or anywhere else in the world, pretty much.
And what did the target sheet show that I shot?
It was a zombie.
It was a zombie. I was actually already preparing for Resident Evil 8. Fantastic. No, it was a great time. We had a great time with Resident Evil. We had a great time preparing for Russian armament.
Yes.
And so I think we talked quite a bit about Resident Evil, and it's pretty clear that we like it a lot.
A lot.
So
One final thing.
Okay, okay.
One final thing that I think we need to bring up, and that it would be remiss of me not to bring this up, is so that Capcom gets a lot of the publishers of Resident Evil, the remake that we played, and now Resident Evil 7.
Right. I'm sorry.
So, yeah, no. So Capcom gets they have gotten a lot of crap for being the kind of company that releases their games over and over and over again. You have Street Fighter 2, then you have Street Fighter 2 Turbo, then you have Street Fighter 2 Turbo Championship, Street Fighter 2 Turbo Championship Alpha Edition, First Strike, and they do this with all their games. You know, there's a version, then a special edition, then a super special edition, director's cut, Turbo Super Special Edition. So Capcom got a bad reputation for doing this, but I had this realization when we were playing this HD upvert on my PlayStation 4, which is that, maybe it's a little bit money hungry, but goddamn, at least Capcom's making an effort to ensure that these games are still playable on modern systems, whether that's the PC or the newest consoles.
They're doing the history preservation work that others are not.
Because, to look at an obvious example that's near and dear to both our hearts, Konami. So you look at that, it's clear that company doesn't give a fig about preserving their old games. Is it even going to be possible to play the old Metal Gear, the MSX versions of the Metal Gear games? Are they going to have some officially supported version where you can pay money to get an official version of the game? I doubt it. So at least Capcom, maybe they're doing it for only profit reasons, but at least they're the sort of company that understands that these games are great and they need to ensure that they're playable for future generations.
And I mean, if they make a buck with it, so...
God bless them.
God bless them, right? I totally agree. So what I just said, they do the preservation work of video game history that usually ends up being the job of the players.
Yes.
And the fan base,
Yes.
So that's kind of cool, and I'm also happy that because the refurbishment of the Resident Evil 1 and 0, they're both great games. They have their little ups and downs here, of course, but I'd love to see them also re-release Resident Evil 2. I think a lot of people are hoping for that.
They're thinking it might happen. The rumors are, I think, that it's in consideration.
Yeah, rumors have been at it for quite some time, so I hope we'll see that soon because we should play that then.
Resident Evil 2?
Yeah.
For a follow-up, perhaps?
I might come back to Atlanta for that.
There we go. There we go.
So I think we already answered the question, but is it a blast from the past?
Hell yes. Blast.
Hell yeah.
Blast from the past, certified.
Welcome to the family, son. All right, guys. Thanks for listening. I hope you want to play Resident Evil after hearing this. I hope we could make you a little bit excited to get back into video game nostalgia. That was Blast from the Past. Thank you, Michael. And
thank you, Ragnar.
Well, we see you next time. We should work on an ending.
A closer, yeah.
Yeah, something. Let's say bye.
Bye.
Bye.